Listen to me now. Stop scrolling. Stop breathing shallow. Stop letting the noise of the world drown the whisper of your destiny. Because tonight is not ordinary. And the seconds you are living right now have weight, they have consequence, they have eternity pressing against them. And God is speaking to those who still know how to tremble at His voice, to those who still believe that time can bend when obedience rises, to those who still understand that midnight is not just a clock change, but a spiritual threshold where decisions either crown you or crush you. And God said, there are 5 things to do before midnight on January 3rd. Not tomorrow, not someday, not when you feel ready, but now, while your heart is still beating and your spirit can still respond. There are moments in history when heaven leans forward and waits, when God pauses the movement of the unseen realm to see who will move first. And this is one of those moments. Many people think God only speaks in comfort, but God often speaks in urgency, because urgency awakens faith. When God gives a time instruction, it is never random. Time is His servant, not His master. And when He marks a date, it means something is converging. January 3rd is not just another page on the calendar. It is a gate. Gates do not open by wishing, they open by alignment. And before midnight, God is looking for alignment, not excuses, not delays, not explanations, but alignment of heart, mind, will, and action. The first thing God said to do before midnight is to confront what you have been avoiding. God said, stop pretending you don't see it. Stop calling delay wisdom. Stop calling fear patience. There is something God has already shown you, already convicted you about, already pressed on your heart, and you have learned how to manage the discomfort instead of obeying the instruction. God said confrontation is not condemnation. Confrontation is invitation. When God confronts you, He's not trying to expose you to shame you. He's trying to free you before the weight of avoidance becomes a prison. You have been praying for change while avoiding the very door that leads to it. God said tonight you must look directly at what you've been running from, because avoidance is a silent agreement with stagnation. God said you cannot carry new authority into the next season while hiding from old obedience. The thing you keep pushing to the side is the thing holding the key. You think it's small, but God says small disobedience grows into large limitation. You think you can outrun it with productivity, but God says speed without direction only takes you farther from peace. Before midnight, God said, call it what it is, name it, face it, acknowledge it. Because the moment you stop running, grace starts working. Heaven does not empower denial. Heaven empowers honesty. And when you finally say, God, I see it, I admit it, I stop resisting, something breaks in the unseen realm. The second thing God said to do before midnight is to release what has expired. God said there are relationships, mindsets, habits, even prayers that were once right, but are no longer alive. And you keep holding on because at one time they carried you, at one time they comforted you, at one time they made sense. But God says seasons change, and what was provision yesterday can become poison tomorrow if you refuse to let go. Expiration does not mean it was wrong. Expiration means it fulfilled its purpose. God said clinging to expired things is the fastest way to dishonor what He is trying to birth next. You feel tired not because you are weak, but because you are carrying what God never asked you to carry into this season. God said you are exhausted from dragging yesterday into today. Before midnight, God said you must let go without bitterness, without nostalgia, without guilt. Letting go is not betrayal, it is obedience. God is not asking you to burn bridges in anger. He is asking you to close doors in peace. Peace is not passive, it is decisive. When you release what has expired, you create space for what is ordained. God cannot fill hands that refuse to open. The third thing God said to do before midnight is to speak life with authority. God said your words have been too small for the destiny He placed inside you. You have been speaking from fear instead of from faith, from memory instead of promise, from wounds instead of wisdom. God said your voice is not decoration, it is a tool. The unseen realm listens when you speak in alignment with truth. Silence in moments that require declaration is not humility, it is agreement with limitation. God said tonight you must speak, not to impress people, but to command your atmosphere. God said speak over your mind because anxiety has been getting too comfortable. Speak over your future because uncertainty has been lying to you. Speak over your household because chaos only stays where authority is silent. When God created, He spoke. When He established order, He spoke. When He released purpose, He spoke. And He said, you are made in His image, not to echo fear, but to release truth. Before midnight, God said, open your mouth and align your words with what He has already decreed. Even if your voice shakes, speak. Faith is not the absence of fear. It is the refusal to let fear have the final word. The fourth thing God said to do before midnight is to plant a seed of obedience that costs you something. God said faith that costs nothing produces nothing. You have been asking for harvest while protecting comfort. But God said sacrifice is the language of trust. When you give what matters, you prove what matters most. This is not about impressing God. He sees the heart. This is about shifting the spiritual economy around your life. When you release something valuable in obedience, you break the authority of lack and fear. God said the seed is not always money. Sometimes it is time. Sometimes it is pride. Sometimes it is forgiveness. Sometimes it is obedience without applause. But before midnight, God said, plant something that stretches you. Do not calculate it to feel safe. Do not negotiate it to feel in control. Trust is not trust if you still feel comfortable. God said, the seed you plant tonight carries instruction for your future. Seeds speak. They tell tomorrow what to become. And when you sow in faith, heaven responds with precision. The fifth thing God said to do before midnight is to consecrate your expectation. God said you have allowed disappointment to lower your vision. You stopped expecting because expectation hurt when it went unfulfilled. But God said guarded hope is still hope. And hope deferred does not mean hope denied. God said, clean your expectation from cynicism, from bitterness, from past failure. Expect again, not foolishly, but faithfully. Expect not because circumstances look favorable, but because God is faithful to His word. God said expectation is not fantasy, it is alignment with promise. When you expect, you make room. When you expect, you prepare. When you expect, you position yourself to recognize the answer when it comes. God said before midnight, lift your expectation back to where it belongs. Do not shrink it to protect yourself. Stretch it to honor Him. God is not offended by big expectation. He is offended by unbelief disguised as wisdom. Now hear this deeply. God said these 5 things are not suggestions. They are instructions. Instructions are time sensitive. Delayed obedience is still disobedience when time is attached. God said January 3rd is a hinge. What you do before midnight determines what has access to you after. This is not superstition. This is spiritual law. Alignment unlocks acceleration. Resistance invites delay. God is not punishing you. He is positioning you. You may feel the weight of this moment, and that is good. Weight produces seriousness. Seriousness produces action. Action produces change. God said, do not let this moment pass as just another emotional experience. Emotion fades, but obedience anchors. Heaven is watching for movement. Not perfection, movement, not confidence, obedience, not clarity, faith. God said, you do not need more confirmation. You already know what to do. You felt it as the words were spoken. That stirring in your chest is not anxiety, it is conviction mixed with invitation. God does not shout to confuse. He speaks clearly to those who are listening. And you are listening now. That means responsibility has shifted. Time is moving. Seconds are falling away like sand. Midnight is approaching whether you act or not. But destiny does not wait for comfort. God said, stand up in your spirit. Decide, release, speak, sow, expect. These are not heavy burdens, they are keys. Keys feel small in the hand, but they open massive doors. Do not negotiate with delay. Do not argue with fear. Do not consult doubt. God said this is between you and him. No crowd, no applause, no explanation, quiet. Obedience often produces the loudest miracles. And when you wake up after midnight, something will be different. Not because the clock changed, but because you did. God said, I am watching, not with anger, but with anticipation. Heaven is ready to respond to movement. Angels are not waiting for perfection. They are waiting for obedience. The unseen realm shifts when a human decides to trust God over comfort. Let your heart be steady. Let your mind be clear. Let your will be firm. This is not the end of something. It is the interruption of delay. God is not asking for years. He is asking for tonight. And tonight is enough to change the direction of an entire life, an entire household, an entire future, because obedience compresses time and faith releases acceleration. And God honors those who honor his voice before midnight on January 3rd, when the world is distracted, but the faithful are listening, and the ones who move now will understand later why this moment mattered more than they could see, as the door begins to open and the weight lifts and the shift happens and the silence breaks and the next season starts, not with noise but with alignment, as you step forward and do what God said, while there is still time and the clock is still moving and your spirit is still willing and heaven is still waiting for your response, as you choose now to obey and move and release and speak and plant and expect, because this moment is not repeating, and what you do with it will echo into everything that comes next and beyond as you move before midnight. While God is near and the gate is open and the instruction is clear and your heart knows exactly what to do as you step into it, without looking back and without hesitation and without fear and without delay and without needing another sign and without another word, because this is the word and this is the moment and this is the obedience. That changes everything as you move now and align now and act now, while the night is still holding the door open and God is watching for the step that begins it all, and the first movement that unlocks what has been waiting, and the unseen response, and the shift begins, and the weight breaks, and the future bends, and the instruction becomes reality, and the silence becomes movement, and the obedience becomes destiny, and the moment becomes history. As you move now before midnight, when the call is clear and the time is now, and your spirit rises to answer God as the night holds its breath, and you step forward into what has been waiting, and the door opens and the next begins, and everything shifts as you obey and move and align and respond without waiting for another moment, because this is the moment and it is happening now, and you are stepping into it as the clock continues and your decision stands and the unseen moves and the future opens, and God responds as you move forward and do exactly what he said to do before midnight on January 3rd, while there is still time and the gate is still open and the invitation is still standing, and your obedience becomes the beginning of what you have been waiting for as you move now. And do not look back, and do not hesitate, and do not delay, and do not doubt, and do not resist, and do not retreat, and do not shrink, and do not negotiate, and do not excuse, and do not wait, because this is the moment and it is unfolding, and you are stepping into it now as the clock moves and heaven responds, and everything begins to shift and unfold and align and open and move and respond and change as you act now in obedience and faith and alignment and expectation and surrender and authority and trust and movement, as the night continues and the door opens wider and the unseen responds and the future begins and the instruction becomes reality and the obedience becomes theirs. Tiny, and the moment becomes irreversible as you move now into what God has prepared and spoken and appointed and aligned for you before midnight. As the time continues and the moment holds and the decision is made and the shift begins and everything moves forward and nothing remains the same as you step into it now and obey and move and align and respond as the night carries your decision forward into what comes next and beyond, and continues as the clock moves and your obedience stands and the unseen response and the future opens and everything begins right now as you move before midnight and do exactly what God said. Hear me again, because there is another layer God wants to press into your spirit, and it is heavier, sharper, and more demanding than comfort. God says many people confuse belief with agreement, but belief that does not move the body is only mental alignment, not faith. Faith is visible. Faith leaves evidence. Faith changes behavior before it changes circumstances. God says, if your life looks the same after you say you believe, then belief never reached obedience. Tonight is about crossing that line where belief stops being internal and becomes embodied, where your feet follow what your mouth has been saying for years. God says there is a law operating right now that many ignore. Whatever you delay, you empower to resist you. Delay gives fear time to organize, doubt time to recruit, and excuses time to sound reasonable. That is why God presses urgency into this moment. He is not rushing you, He is rescuing you from the slow erosion of courage. Courage does not disappear suddenly. It leaks out through postponed obedience. God says tonight you seal the leaks. You decide that fear does not get another meeting, doubt does not get another vote, and hesitation does not get another voice. God says you have underestimated how much authority He placed in your deck. Ishans. You keep asking Him to change things He already placed under your governance. God governs the universe, but He gave you stewardship over your life. Heaven responds to decisions, not wishes. God says when you decide in alignment with truth, unseen systems rearrange themselves to support your obedience. That is why indecision is so dangerous. It leaves systems untouched, but one clear decision can disrupt years of stagnation. God says, do not wait to feel powerful before you act. Power often follows movement. Many think they must feel bold to obey, but God says obedience is what generates boldness. You step while trembling, and courage meets you in motion. Stillness is not safety when God has spoken. Stillness becomes disobedience when instruction is clear. God says tonight, movement matters more than mastery. You do not need to know every step. You need to take the first one. God says there are unseen witnesses observing how you handle this moment, not to accuse you, but to align with you. When you move in obedience, support appears you could not see before. When you hesitate, support remains hidden. God says heaven respects clarity. Confusion delays assistance. That is why clarity through obedience unlocks help that was already assigned. You are not alone in this moment, but you must move first. God says, let go of the illusion that you can manage both obedience and control. Control feels safe, but it is faith's enemy. Faith requires surrender, and surrender feels like loss until you realize what you gain. God says control keeps you small enough to feel safe. Surrender stretches you large enough to fulfill purpose. Purpose always demands expansion, and expansion always demands release. Tonight, God says, choose expansion over safety. God says, stop interpreting resistance as a sign to stop. Resistance often confirms that you are moving in the right direction. Doors that matter are rarely unguarded. Pressure does not mean abandonment. Pressure often signals importance. God says, do not retreat when things push back. Pushback is not proof of error, it is often proof of impact. The unseen resists what threatens to shift order, and your obedience threatens more than you realize. God says you have been asking Him to remove pressure, but He says pressure is shaping you into someone who can carry what you asked for. Capacity is built under weight. Authority is forged under responsibility. God says if He removed all pressure, He would also remove your preparation. So instead of asking for escape, ask for alignment. Alignment turns pressure into propulsion. God says there is a difference between waiting on Him and hiding behind waiting. Waiting is active when God is silent. It is disobedience when God has spoken. God says He has already spoken enough for you to move. More information will not produce more obedience. At some point, information becomes a substitute for trust. God says tonight is not about learning more. It is about doing what you already know. God says, reclaim reverence. Reverence is not fear of punishment. It is awareness of weight. When you truly understand who God is, you stop treating instruction casually. Casual obedience produces shallow results. Reverent obedience produces lasting change. God says, approach this moment with seriousness, not anxiety. Anxiety doubts outcome. Reverence honors instruction. Honor opens doors. Anxiety cannot touch. God says your future self is already benefiting from what you choose tonight. Decisions travel forward in time. Obedience plants trees whose shade you will sit under later. Disobedience plants thorns you will one day have to remove. God says tonight, you decide what kind of landscape you're walking into tomorrow. Tomorrow is not random, it is cultivated. God says, stop why. Ting for permission from people who are just as uncertain as you are. Permission from others is not a requirement when God has already authorized you. Seeking approval often disguises fear of responsibility. God says when you obey Him, you accept responsibility for the outcome. And that is where maturity begins. Immaturity asks, what if I fail? Maturity asks, what if I disobey? God says the reason this moment feels intense is because intensity precedes transition. Birth is intense because something is changing form. God says you are not breaking down, you are breaking through. But breakthrough requires pressure, decision, and movement. Comfort rarely announces transition. Discomfort does. That is why God uses moments like this to awaken you. God says, remember who you are accountable to. At the end of every season, it is not the crowd that evaluates obedience, it is God. Crowds celebrate outcomes. God honors faithfulness. Faithfulness is measured in moments like this, private, quiet, decisive. God says, choose to be faithful when no one is clapping, because those are the moments that shape who you become. God says, do not romanticize delay. Delay does not make obedience sweeter, it makes it harder. The longer you wait, the more resistance builds. That is why God says, move while the door is still open. Doors do close, not because God is cruel, but because seasons change. Mistiming carries consequences, even when forgiveness is available. God says tonight protects you from unnecessary struggle later. God says simplify your obedience. You are overcomplicating what He made clear. Obedience does not require drama, it requires resolve. Resolve is quiet, firm, unshakable. God says decide once so you do not have to decide again. Repeated decision-making drains strength. One resolved commitment conserves power. God says the reason you feel exposed when you consider obeying is because obedience removes the hiding places ego depends on. Ego wants control, credit, and comfort. Obedience wants alignment, surrender, and truth. God says ego negotiates, obedience responds. Tonight, God says, let obedience speak louder than ego. God says you are not late, you are at the edge. Edges feel unstable because they require balance. God says, trust Him enough to stay. The ground does not always appear before you move. Sometimes it forms under your feet. That is not recklessness, that is faith responding to instruction. God says you have prayed for clarity, but clarity is not always information, it is conviction. You have conviction now, that is clarity. God says honor it. When you honor conviction, clarity increases. When you ignore conviction, confusion grows. Tonight is about honoring what you feel stirring deep inside. God says do not underestimate how quickly things can change when alignment is restored. One night of obedience can reverse months of stagnation. One decision can unlock years of delay. God says acceleration is real when resistance is removed. You are closer than you think, but closeness without movement still leaves distance. God says, lift your internal posture. Stop seeing yourself as someone hoping God will act. See yourself as someone responding to God's direction. Response positions you as a participant, not a spectator. God does not need spectators. He moves through participants. God says, breathe, steady your heart, and act. Not tomorrow, not later, not after one more sign. Act now, because obedience has a window, and this window is still open. God says, honor the moment while it is still alive. Moments ignored do not come back the same way. God says, when you move, do it fully. Half obedience produces double-minded results. Do not keep one foot in safety and one foot in faith. Double-mindedness weakens authority. God says, choose fully, commit fully, obey fully. Full obedience releases full effect. God says, this is not about proving yourself. It is about trusting Him. Trust is visible when you move without guarantees. Guarantees remove the need for faith. God says faith is the currency of this moment, and obedience is how you spend it. God says you are being invited into a higher level of responsibility. And responsibility always precedes increase. Increase without responsibility destroys. Responsibility without increase refines. God says tonight you accept responsibility through obedience, and increase will follow in its time. God says, let this night mark you. Not emotionally, but spiritually. Let it be remembered as the night you stopped negotiating and started aligning. The night you moved without applause. The night you trusted God over comfort. The night you obeyed while the door was still open and time was still moving and the instruction was still alive and your spirit was still willing and the moment still had weight and you chose to respond while you could, and the unseen responded back as alignment took place and the shift continued to unfold and the future began to rearrange itself around your obedience as the night carried your decision forward and everything started to move in a new direction as you stepped into it without hesitation while the time remained and the invitation stood, and God watched your response as you moved forward into what was waiting, and the change continued, and the door stayed open, and the alignment deepened, and the next began to take shape as you moved now and continued moving and did not retreat and did not delay and did not negotiate, but acted and aligned and responded as the moment held and the instruction remained, and your obedience carried you forward into what comes next and beyond. Listen carefully, because God is pressing something deeper now, something that separates those who admire faith from those who live by it. God says there is a difference between being inspired and being transformed. Inspiration excites the mind, but transformation restructures the will. Many people chase moments that make them feel alive, but God is calling you into a life that is aligned. Alignment does not always feel dramatic, but it is powerful. When alignment is present, even quiet steps shake unseen foundations. God says the greatest battles in your life are not fought in public, but in the private decisions no one applauds. You have been waiting for a visible breakthrough, but God says invisible alignment must come first. Order always precedes manifestation. Chaos delays fulfillment. That is why God has been dealing with your inner structure, your motives, your consistency, your obedience when it cost you comfort. God says tonight is not just about action, it is about posture. A surrendered posture invites authority. God says stop measuring your progress by speed alone. Speed without stability leads to collapse. God is more interested in who you are becoming than how fast you are moving. Becoming shapes sustainability. God says He is building endurance into you so that when doors open, you do not rush through them unprepared and lose what you prayed for. Preparation is mercy disguised as delay, but once preparation is complete, delay becomes disobedience. Tonight marks the shift from preparation to movement. God says you are not disqualified by your past hesitation. Mercy covered what you did not know. But now clarity has come, and clarity brings responsibility. God says, do not confuse mercy with permission to remain unchanged. Mercy restores you so you can obey, not so you can stay the same. Obedience is the fruit of mercy rightly received. God says your emotions are loud right now because truth is confronting habit. Habit resists change even when change is necessary. God says discipline is not punishment. It is alignment repeated until it becomes identity. Tonight you choose discipline over impulse, conviction over comfort, truth over convenience. These choices may feel heavy now, but they produce freedom later. God says there are patterns in your life that cannot be prayed away. They must be interrupted by obedience. Prayer invites God into the process, but obedience removes what resists Him. You have prayed sincerely, but God says now you must act deliberately. Action completes what prayer initiates. Prayer without obedience is incomplete conversation. God says, stop outsourcing responsibility for your growth. Teachers can instruct, voices can encourage, but only you can obey. Obedience cannot be delegated. No one can move for you. God says tonight you stand on your own faith, not borrowed conviction. Borrowed conviction fades when pressure comes, but personal obedience anchors you when storms rise. God says, do not despise the simplicity of what He is asking. Complexity often hides pride. Simplicity requires humility. God says simple obedience produces profound results because it leaves no room for self-glory. When obedience is simple, God alone receives the credit. That is how He protects you from pride while increasing your influence. God says, examine what you tolerate. What you tolerate teaches others how to treat you, but more importantly, it teaches your own spirit what is acceptable. God says tolerance of disorder invites disorder to stay. Tonight is about setting boundaries in obedience, not out of anger, but out of reverence for what God is building in you. God says you are entering a season where excuses will no longer protect you. Grace will still cover you, but excuses will no longer shield you from consequence. God says maturity is when you stop explaining and start aligning. Explanations satisfy people. Alignment satisfies God. God says your life is speaking even when your mouth is silent. Your consistency preaches louder than your declarations. God says, align your actions with what you claim to believe so your life carries authority. Authority flows from integrity, and integrity is alignment maintained over time. God says, do not fear the cost of obedience more than the cost of disobedience. Disobedience always costs more, even when it feels cheaper in the moment. The price is paid later with interest. Obedience may feel costly now, but it pays dividends you cannot calculate yet. God says, choose the cost that leads to freedom. God says, let go of the need to understand everything before you obey. Understanding often follows obedience, not before it. God says, revelation is released in motion. When you move, insight follows. When you stand still, demanding explanation, clarity waits. Trust unlocks understanding. God says tonight you are not just responding to instruction, you are establishing a pattern. Patterns shape destiny. What you do consistently becomes who you are eventually. God says, let obedience become your default response, not your last resort. A default posture of obedience shortens seasons of struggle. God says the reason obedience feels lonely is because few choose it when it is inconvenient. But loneliness in obedience is temporary. Regret in disobedience lasts longer. God says you are never truly alone when you obey Him. Alignment draws unseen support that isolation cannot erase. God says, stop comparing your process to others. Comparison breeds either pride or discouragement. and both distort obedience. God is not measuring you against another person's assignment. He measures faithfulness to what He entrusted to you. Stay in your lane. Obey your instruction. God says the night often carries clarity because distractions are quieter. That is why God speaks strongly in moments like this. He is not trying to overwhelm you. He is trying to focus you. Focus sharpens obedience. Distraction dulls conviction. God says, guard your focus fiercely. God says, when you obey, do not look back to see who noticed. Looking back slows momentum. Obedience that seeks validation loses purity. God says, obey because He spoke, not because others approve. Approval follows obedience, not before it. God says, allow yourself to grieve what you are releasing without returning to it. Grief acknowledges loss. Obedience prevents retreat. You can honor what was without clinging to it. God says, forward does not dishonor the past, it fulfills it. God says your obedience tonight is building a testimony you have not lived yet. Testimonies are born in private obedience long before they are told publicly. God says this moment is planting a story you will one day tell. Not about ease, but about trust. God says you do not need to be fearless to obey. You need to be faithful. Faithfulness acts even when fear is present. Courage is fear that decided not to rule. God says, let faith rule tonight. God says, do not rush past reflection, but do not linger in hesitation. Reflect enough to align, then move. Overthinking is often disguised avoidance. God says clarity has already been given. Now movement is required. God says seal this moment with resolve. Resolve is not emotion. It is commitment sustained when emotion fades. God says decide so firmly that temptation finds no negotiation room. A resolved heart is a protected heart. God says, when you obey, expect resistance, but do not interpret resistance as failure. Resistance is often confirmation that movement has begun. God says, stay steady. Consistency defeats resistance over time. God says, let obedience redefine your identity. You are not someone trying to obey, you are someone who obeys. Identity shapes behavior. Behavior reinforces identity. God says, step into who obedience is forming you to be. God says, this moment is shaping the trajectory of your days ahead. Trajectories are altered by small shifts made at critical moments. This is a critical moment. God says, honor it with action. God says, breathe again, steady yourself, and move forward with clarity, not panic. Panic rushes, obedience is deliberate. God says deliberate steps taken in faith outrun frantic movement driven by fear. God says the night is still holding space for your response. Time is still moving, but the invitation remains. God says, respond while the door is open, while conviction is clear, while resolve is possible, while obedience can still shape what comes next as you move forward now in alignment, in trust, in surrender, in clarity, as the unseen continues to respond and the path continues to form and your obedience continues to carry weight and the future continues to bend and the process continues to unfold as you walk forward steadily, decisively, faithfully, responding to God as the moment continues and the alignment deepens and the next season takes shape through your obedience now and beyond. Now let this moment settle into your spirit, not as noise, not as emotion, but as a sacred weight. God is not asking you to admire these words. He is asking you to answer them. This is the point where reflection must turn into resolve, where awareness must turn into alignment. God is inviting you to look honestly at your life, not with shame, not with fear, but with truth. And ask yourself whether your steps are matching the voice you say you trust. This is not about perfection. It is about direction. God honors direction when it is chosen with sincerity and courage. Stand still for a breath and examine where you have drifted, where you have delayed, where you have settled for less than what God stirred in you long ago. Let that awareness awaken reverence, not regret. Regret looks backward and weakens. Reverence looks upward and strengthens. God is near to those who are willing to return with humility and determination. You do not need to rebuild your life in one night, but you do need to realign your heart in this moment. God is calling you to renew your purpose, not as an abstract idea, but as a living commitment. Purpose is not discovered once and kept forever. It is renewed each time you choose obedience over convenience. Tonight is an invitation to recommit your will, to say with your actions that God is not an accessory to your life, but the center of it. When God becomes the center, clarity follows, strength returns, and direction sharpens. Let this be the moment you stop living divided, stop speaking faith while practicing hesitation, stop longing for closeness with God while keeping distance through delay. God is not distant. Alignment closes the gap. Every step toward obedience is a step closer to Him. Walk that step now, not loudly, not dramatically, but firmly and sincerely. Carry this challenge with you. Live in such a way that your daily decisions reflect your reverence for God. Let your integrity speak when your mouth is silent. Let your obedience preach before your words ever do. Choose faithfulness when no one is watching, and trust that God sees what others miss. Rise from this moment with a settled heart and a steady spirit. Do not rush forward recklessly, but do not retreat into comfort. Walk forward with intention, humility, and courage. Let your life become a quiet testimony of alignment, a living response to the voice of God that called you to more. And as you move, remember this: God does not call you closer to burden you, but to strengthen you, not to diminish you, but to refine you, not to confuse you, but to anchor you in truth. Walk with Him in reverence, respond to Him in obedience, and let your life reflect the honor due to God alone.